June 15, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. Dawn breaks over a restless sea. The sky burns pale gold, streaked with smoke from distant naval bombardment. On the cliffs above the beaches, Japanese Marines peer through binoculars, waiting for what they believe will be another small-scale landing. A few transports, perhaps a company or two. But as the early light sharpens, their confidence begins to fade. The horizon, once empty, is now moving. At first, it looks like a dark line on the ocean. Then it grows. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of gray silhouettes, stretching from one end of the sea to the other. The water churns white with wakes. Landing craft, small and fast, dart between enormous LSTs, floating fortresses belching smoke and flame. The Japanese officers shout orders, disbelief in their voices. Their coastal guns open fire, shells whistling into the surf. Yet the swarm keeps coming. Within minutes, the sea itself seems alive, roaring with engines, rippling with iron. The first Higgins boats lower their ramps, and U.S. Marines surge into the water. One Japanese observer mutters, trembling, "We never saw anything like this before." The age of industrial invasion has arrived. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most decisive phase. For more than 2 years, the United States had clawed its way across the ocean, island by island, slowly dismantling the Japanese Empire's defensive perimeter. Victories at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Kwajalein had come at staggering cost, but each had brought the American military closer to its final objective, the Japanese homeland itself. To reach it, the Americans needed bases within range of B-29 Superfortress bombers. The next step on the map was clear: the Mariana Islands, a strategic chain in the heart of the Pacific, home to the heavily fortified island of Saipan. For the Japanese military, Saipan was sacred ground, the first true line of defense for the Empire's inner sphere. From its airfields, Japanese bombers could still threaten Allied supply routes, and its loss would place Japan's home islands within 3,000 kilometers of American bombers. If Saipan fell, Tokyo would be under direct threat. The Americans understood this too. That's why, in the spring of 1944, Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet and Lieutenant General Holland, Howlin Mad, Smith's Marines, began assembling one of the largest amphibious invasion forces in human history. Over 535 ships, including 15 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, and 300 landing craft, would carry more than 70,000 U.S. Marines and soldiers toward Saipan. The Japanese garrison, about 32,200 men of the 43rd Division and the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, prepared to defend to the death. They had dug into the island's volcanic ridges, carved caves into cliffs, and fortified beaches with anti-tank trenches and machine gun nests. But despite their preparation, the Japanese defenders were unprepared for what they were about to face. Until that point in the Pacific War, no nation in history had attempted an amphibious operation on such a scale. The Americans had learned bitter lessons from Tarawa, where poor planning and underestimated defenses had led to devastating losses in shallow reef water. From that failure, they had built a machine, not just of men and steel, but of coordination, logistics, and engineering. Central to that machine were the landing craft, small, rugged vessels capable of carrying entire platoons of troops, tanks and vehicles directly from ship to shore. Designed and built by an unlikely hero, Andrew Higgins, these Higgins boats, LCVPs, became the backbone of U.S. amphibious warfare. They were simple, efficient, and mass-producible, a weapon of industrial genius. Each could carry 36 fully armed Marines, who stormed ashore through a front ramp that dropped open like the jaws of a steel predator. Supported by larger LSTs, landing ship tanks, and LVT Amtracs, once at safety toilette, the Americans could now deploy men, armor, and artillery directly onto beaches under fire, something no other military on Earth had achieved. By June 1944, the U.S. Navy had perfected this system into a terrifying rhythm, a mechanized ballet of steel and discipline. From their vantage points on the cliffs, the Japanese Marines would soon witness it for the first time, and it would shake their faith in everything they knew about warfare. At dawn on June 15, 1944, the calm blue waters off Saipan erupted into thunder. The Americans had arrived. The invasion fleet, stretching over 60 kilometers of open sea, was unlike anything the Japanese defenders had ever seen. Even veteran soldiers who had fought in Guadalcanal and New Guinea stared in disbelief as an armada of steel and smoke filled the horizon. From the cliffs above the landing beaches, the Japanese coastal observers watched in awe. Hundreds of ships moved in perfect formation, their gray hulls glinting in the rising sun. At first, the defenders assumed many of the smaller craft were supply barges or escort boats, until the first wave began to advance toward shore. What the Japanese were seeing was a new form of warfare entirely: industrial amphibious assault. It began with the naval bombardment. At Oro 700 hours, American battleships and cruisers unleashed a wall of fire. The sky turned black as thousands of shells crashed into the beaches, tearing apart bunkers and trench lines. Entire hillsides disappeared under smoke and dust. The Japanese artillerymen, crouched in their caves, felt the ground tremble beneath them. The bombardment was relentless, a storm of steel designed to annihilate every defensive position before the Marines even landed. But even as the shells fell, the next phase of the assault was already underway. From the massive attack transports, waves of LCVPs, LSTs, and LVTs roared to life. Each landing craft was packed with men, tanks, and supplies. They churned through the surf in carefully timed sequences, forming tight attack waves that would deliver thousands of Marines to the beaches within minutes. The Japanese officers had no answer for this. Their defensive plans were based on traditional naval doctrine, waiting for troop transports to unload far offshore, then engaging the landing forces as they came ashore. They had never imagined an army capable of landing entire divisions directly onto the beach in a matter of hours. As the American landing craft advanced, the Japanese artillery finally opened fire. Shells splashed into the sea, tearing apart some of the incoming boats. But it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a sword. For every landing craft destroyed, 10 more took its place. The defenders' radio reports grew frantic. One Japanese officer's log, recovered after the battle, recorded his disbelief. The sea itself was covered with ships. Even the horizon disappeared. They kept coming. Endless waves. We never saw anything like this. When the first wave of U.S. Marines hit the beaches, the real horror began. Japanese machine guns blazed from bunkers and cliffs, mowing down the front ranks. But the Higgins boats never stopped. One after another, they dropped their ramps and released more Marines into the chaos. Behind them came LVTs carrying tanks and flamethrowers, followed by bulldozers and engineers clearing wreckage to make way for more troops. The defenders had expected a battle of attrition, slow, methodical, human against human. What they were witnessing instead was mechanized warfare at a scale beyond imagination. The Americans had turned invasion into an assembly line, a cold, efficient process of industrial war. For the Japanese, this was more than a defeat of strategy. It was the moment they realized that bravery and discipline alone could not stop machinery, built by an empire of factories. The power that overwhelmed Saipan did not come solely from courage or numbers. It came from machines, and behind those machines stood the might of American industry. The Japanese soldiers on the cliffs saw not just ships and landing craft, but the physical embodiment of something they had underestimated from the beginning: the United States' ability to turn invention into mass production. At the heart of that spectacle was a single design, the LCVP, the Higgins boat. It was a small, box-like craft, made mostly of wood and powered by a diesel engine that could push it across the surf at 12 knots. It looked crude, even fragile, but it could carry 36 fully armed Marines or a jeep, drop its bow ramp, and discharge them directly onto a hostile beach in seconds. The man behind it, Andrew Jackson Higgins, was no admiral or officer. He was a shipbuilder from New Orleans whose background was in swamp boats. His genius lay in simplicity: a flat-bottomed hull that could skim over reefs, a retractable ramp that turned transport into assault. What made it revolutionary wasn't its sophistication, but its efficiency. It could be built fast, cheaply, and in enormous numbers. By mid-1944, American factories were producing 20,000 landing craft of various types, from the tiny Higgins boats to the massive LSTs that carried tanks and heavy vehicles. Every island invasion, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, now Saipan, had refined the formula. Each time, engineers and Marines returned with lessons that improved the next wave of design. In contrast, the Japanese Navy had virtually no equivalent. Their amphibious capability had stagnated after 1942. The Japanese relied on small barges and converted ships that could not land heavy armor or large formations directly on shore. They believed that amphibious invasions on this scale were impossible. So when the Saipan invasion began, the defenders' disbelief wasn't simply emotional, it was technological shock. They were watching an entire system of warfare that Japan could not replicate. From a distance, the sea looked like chaos. But, to military observers, it was precision in motion. 1,000 vessels performing a synchronized dance choreographed to the minute. Each wave of landing craft had a purpose. Engineers to clear the beach, infantry to secure the perimeter, tanks and artillery to push inland. The Japanese artillery commanders could destroy a dozen boats, but there were always more behind them, because the Americans had turned amphibious assault into mass-produced efficiency. For the defenders who had prepared for individual heroics, this was the most demoralizing truth of all. The Battle of Saipan became a textbook demonstration of how technology, logistics, and doctrine could merge into something unstoppable. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had learned from every prior disaster, and by 1944, amphibious assault had evolved into a science. First came the naval gunfire preparation, not the short, symbolic bombardments of early operations, but hours of sustained shelling from battleships and cruisers. The Americans had learned that victory required total suppression. Next came the aerial coordination, carrier-based fighters, bombers striking known gun emplacement, seconds before the landing craft approached. The timing was mechanical, down to seconds. While shells exploded along the beaches, hundreds of LCVPs and LVTs moved forward in perfectly spaced waves. The communication between naval commanders, beach control officers, and Marine battalion leaders was continuous. The Amphibious Corps now had dedicated radio frequencies for every landing zone, ensuring that even in chaos, the attack unfolded according to plan. The Japanese response was fierce, disciplined, and suicidal. Their Type 96 machine guns and 75 mm field pieces fired relentlessly. Dozens of landing craft were destroyed before reaching shore. Yet each minute, more arrived, each wave overlapping the last. It was this rhythm, this unending flow of men and machines, that broke the defenders' spirit. Japanese officers later described it as fighting against the sea itself. We shot and shot. They did not stop. The ocean kept sending more of them. Every American casualty was instantly replaced. Every destroyed craft was followed by another. Behind it all, the thunder of naval guns never ceased. For the Japanese, whose doctrine emphasized decisive battle and individual valor, this mechanical persistence was terrifying. They realized that the Americans did not fight battles in the old sense. They manufactured victories. By noon on June 15th, after only a few hours of combat, U.S. Marines had established a beachhead 3 kilometers deep. Their landing craft continued to unload supplies, fuel, and artillery. What the Japanese had believed impossible, that an enemy could land tens of thousands of men under fire and keep reinforcing them, had become reality. The defenders' courage remained. But courage could not stop an army built on industrial precision. For the Japanese Marines defending Saipan, what they witnessed on that morning went beyond the battlefield. It was existential horror. They had trained their whole lives believing that victory came through willpower, that a soldier's spirit could overcome material odds. But here, under a sky filled with smoke and the roar of engines, they faced something alien, a nation that fought with machines, mathematics, and endless supplies. From the cliffs, soldiers watched through field glasses as landing craft kept pouring in, even after entire waves had been blown apart. Each time the smoke cleared, there were more boats, more men, more armor. The ocean itself seemed to be birthing an army. Some defenders broke down, screaming at the sight. Others stood silent, transfixed. One Japanese officer later wrote in his diary, "Recovered after the battle, we destroyed many of their boats. They kept coming. It was not human. We could no longer count them." On the beaches, Marines fell by the dozens, hit by mortar fire and machine gun bursts. But behind them came medics, bulldozers, flamethrowers, and tanks. The landing craft went back, reloaded, and returned again, a mechanical tide that never stopped. For the Japanese, this was not war as they knew it. This was industry turned into warfare. They began to understand the real difference between their empire and the United States. Not bravery, not skill, but scale. The Americans could replace what they lost faster than Japan could even count its dead. That realization was devastating. Many Japanese soldiers fought on out of sheer duty, but a quiet despair began to spread through the ranks. For the first time, they doubted victory. Not because of fear, but because they now understood that their enemy had tapped into something limitless. As the battle unfolded, the psychological gap between the two armies widened. The Japanese defenders, conditioned to believe in sacrifice and final resistance, had entered the war expecting to die with honor. But nothing could prepare them for a fight where the enemy seemed immune to destruction. From their bunkers, they watched columns of smoke rise as U.S. landing craft burned, only for new waves to appear moments later. The Americans were not relying on bravery alone. They were relying on systems. Every detail of the invasion had been engineered to reduce chaos. Pre-marked landing lanes, synchronized artillery patterns, precise timing for reinforcements. To the defenders, it felt like fighting a machine that never tired. Reports from captured Japanese officers described their shock at how calm and structured the Americans were, even under fire. The invaders didn't charge blindly or panic when their leaders fell. They kept advancing, methodically, like gears in a vast engine. One Japanese lieutenant reportedly said to his captors after the battle, "We thought you were men. You are factories that walk." The Americans, for their part, were not immune to fear. Marines landing on Saipan described scenes of unimaginable chaos. Boats ripped apart, friends drowning in burning fuel, machine gun fire raking the beaches. Yet, the discipline of the operation gave them purpose. They trusted that behind them was a vast chain of ships, factories, and workers ensuring they would not be abandoned. This trust, that the machine would not fail them, was the unseen advantage of American warfare. For the Japanese, it was the opposite. They were isolated, with no hope of reinforcement or resupply. Each man knew that once he fired his last bullet, there would be no more. And so, for all their courage, the defenders faced not just the American Marines, but the crushing psychological weight of futility. At the heart of the Saipan invasion were commanders who understood that modern war was not won by glory, but by organization. General Holland Howlin Mad Smith, commanding the U.S. Marines, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, overseeing the naval forces, worked with near-perfect coordination. They viewed amphibious warfare as an evolving science, and Saipan as its ultimate experiment. Every move was calculated before the first wave hit the beach. Smith's planners had mapped out 12 separate landing sectors, each assigned to a regiment. Logistics officers had already designated where fuel depots, medical posts, and artillery positions would be built once the beachhead was secured. This precision was alien to the Japanese command structure, which favored heroic initiative over mechanical discipline. While the Americans trusted process, the Japanese trusted instinct, and on Saipan, instinct could not match industrial precision. Japanese commander Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito tried to rally his troops for counterattacks, but the chaos on the beaches was uncontrollable. Communication lines were destroyed, units became isolated, and as the Americans kept landing fresh reinforcements, Saito realized his defenses were collapsing faster than reports could reach him. What had taken him months to prepare was dismantled in hours. From his bunker, Saito radioed Tokyo a grim message. "The enemy has brought a new kind of war. Our courage alone cannot resist it." It was not simply a battle lost. It was an era ending. June 15, 1944, 08:43 hours, Saipan. The first wave of U.S. Marines crashes into the beaches under a storm of fire. The sea, moments earlier alive with the roar of engines, now boils with explosions. Mortar rounds strike the water like volcanic eruptions. Machine gun fire traces red arcs across the surf. Dozens of Higgins boats are shredded before their ramps can drop. Men leap into waist-deep water, their rifles held high, trudging forward through smoke and blood. From the cliffs above, the Japanese defenders unleash their fury. Their Type 96 heavy machine guns rattle in long bursts, cutting down the first ranks of Marines. Mortars explode among the waves, setting landing craft ablaze. For a brief moment, it seems as if the assault will fail, but then something happens that the Japanese had not expected. Even as men fall and boats burn, the next wave of landing craft presses forward, exactly on schedule. Within minutes, the horizon fills again with steel. The second wave lands, then the third. There is no pause, no hesitation, no confusion. American officers on the lead boats shout through smoke, guiding men forward with radios and hand signals. Behind them, amphibious tractors, LVTs, surge ashore, their treads grinding over coral and sand, carrying Sherman tanks and flamethrower units straight into the front line. The Marines begin to dig in, returning fire with Browning machine guns and naval support directed by spotters who somehow remain calm amid the chaos. It is organized chaos, the kind that only an industrial war machine can create. The Japanese counter-battery fire intensifies. One of their coastal guns, a Type 120mm cannon, finds its mark, blowing apart an entire wave of landing craft in one fiery blast. Cheers erupt from the defenders' trenches. For a moment, they believe the tide is turning. But then, over the horizon, another line of LCVPs appears. Wave number 4. Behind it, supply barges. Behind them, LSTs lowering ramps and unloading trucks, bulldozers, and fuel. It dawns on the defenders that this is not just an army. This is an assembly line of destruction. On the command ship offshore, Admiral Spruance watches through binoculars. The beaches are hell, but the plan is working. Communications flow seamlessly from ship to shore. Naval gunners, air controllers, and Marine officers all speaking in a single rhythm of radio chatter. Each piece of the invasion fits like gears in a machine. Every failure is instantly corrected, every setback absorbed. By midday, 8,000 Marines are ashore. Japanese strongpoints have been isolated by flamethrowers and explosives. Shermans crush through barbed wire and pillboxes, turning the beach into a wasteland of smoke and twisted metal. The Japanese fire begins to falter, not because their courage is gone, but because their ammunition is. They cannot reload as fast as the Americans can land. For the first time, the defenders begin to realize the hopelessness of their position. They have fought enemies before, Chinese, British, Australians, but never this, never a force that seemed to regenerate itself endlessly, as if the ocean itself were fighting alongside it. By late afternoon, the American beachhead is secure. The cost is staggering, over 2,000 U.S. casualties in a single day. But the landing has succeeded. The Japanese have lost their coastal guns, their forward trenches, and their chance to stop the invasion at the water's edge. In the fading light, the surviving defenders retreat inland. The beaches that morning were silent sand. By sunset, they are an open wound of war. And still, the sound of landing craft echoes across the waves. Saipan has not yet fallen, but Japan has just seen the future of warfare. As night fell over Saipan, the beaches glowed with the fires of burning landing craft and shattered tanks. The air smelled of salt, oil, and death. Yet even in the darkness, the Americans kept coming. Floodlights from offshore ships lit up the shoreline as engineers cleared obstacles, built command posts, and carved out supply lines. By midnight, the once defended coast had become a massive machine of movement. Thousands of men unloading ammunition, fuel, and rations, working in silence under the hum of generators. From their hidden caves in the ridges above, the Japanese Marines watched with a mixture of rage and disbelief. They had thrown everything they had at the first day's assault. Mortars, artillery, suicide charges, and yet the enemy now stood stronger than ever. Every destroyed landing craft had been replaced. Every gap in the American line had been filled before it could even open. What they were witnessing was not improvisation. It was a war built by engineers, powered by industry, and sustained by logistics. At dawn, the Japanese launched their first counterattack. Hundreds of infantry surged from the ridges, shouting, "Banzai!" as they charged into the fog. It was the purest expression of their military spirit. Courage over logic, sacrifice over survival. But courage alone could not break through American artillery, machine guns, and naval fire support. The assault was annihilated within minutes. The survivors staggered back, shocked and disoriented. Those who had lived through years of war had never seen such firepower. A wall of destruction coordinated with mathematical precision. The Americans seemed to know exactly where they were before they even appeared. By June 16th, the beachhead had expanded to nearly 5 miles wide and 2 miles inland. Bulldozers roared day and night, cutting new roads while cranes unloaded trucks and tanks. Every hour, more landing craft arrived with supplies, medics, and reinforcements. The Japanese defenders could see it clearly now. This was not a temporary invasion. It was an occupation in motion. In one bunker near Garapan, a Japanese Marine sergeant wrote his final note before the next battle. "The enemy moves like a tide. They do not stop when we shoot. They do not pause to fear. Even when we destroy them, more come. Their landing boats fill the sea, as if America itself is attacking us." The psychological collapse of the defenders had begun. They were no longer fighting men. They were fighting a process, a machine that could not be stopped by human effort alone. In contrast, on the American side, there was a quiet, grim determination. The Marines and soldiers, many still shaken from Tarawa and other brutal campaigns, understood that every inch of ground was paid for in blood. But unlike before, they now believed the system behind them, the Navy, the engineers, the factories, would not fail. That belief became their armor. By June 17th, the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division joined the fight, linking up with Marine units inland. Together they pushed toward Mount Tapocho, the island's high ground. The Japanese positions, though fiercely defended, began to crumble under combined naval bombardment and airstrikes. By the end of the second day, Saipan was burning. Entire Japanese strongpoints had vanished beneath the relentless advance. The sound of American tanks echoed through the valleys, the mechanical heartbeats of an empire that had learned to turn industry into warfare. The Japanese commander, General Yoshitsugu Saito, stared across the flames from his headquarters and finally said what many of his men already knew: "We have underestimated the Americans. This is not a military invasion. This is the work of a nation." And with that realization, the battle and Japan's illusion of invincibility began to die. By June 18, 1944, the battle for Saipan had become a war of exhaustion. The beaches that once roared with the thunder of landing craft were now supply depots, endless rows of stacked ammunition, fuel drums, and crates stamped "Made in America." Bulldozers, still blackened by smoke, carved makeshift roads inland as Sherman tanks rolled forward toward Japanese defensive lines. The U.S. Marines and Army infantry had now turned their invasion into a continuous machine of progress. Every destroyed vehicle was replaced within hours. Every wounded Marine was carried back to a hospital ship, where surgeons worked through the night. Even as casualties climbed into the thousands, replacement waves from offshore transports filled every gap in the line. For the Japanese, this was an alien form of war. They had always believed that courage and sacrifice could outlast any material disadvantage. But now they were witnessing the death of that belief. The American system, powered by factories 6,000 miles away, was replacing men and machines faster than the defenders could destroy them. The Japanese 43rd Division, cut off from reinforcements and low on supplies, resorted to desperate measures. Ammunition was rationed to 5 rounds per man. Food dwindled to half a bowl of rice a day. The soldiers began drinking condensed seawater, fighting starvation as well as the enemy. Yet, the Americans kept coming, not in reckless charges, but in methodical advances, yard by yard, bunker by bunker. the U.S. Navy maintained a constant wall of fire around the island. Battleships like the USS Tennessee and USS California hammered ridgelines day and night, while carrier-based Hellcat fighters strafed every visible position. The Japanese had no air support left. Their once mighty navy was shattered, their airfields obliterated. Inside the caves, the defenders could hear the sound of American construction, engines, cranes, and trucks, a chilling reminder that the enemy was building even as they fought. The invasion wasn't temporary, it was permanent. In the early days of July, the Japanese command structure began to collapse. General Yoshitsugu Saito sent his final orders across the island. All remaining troops were to launch one last attack, a banzai charge unlike any before. There would be no retreat, no surrender. On the night of July 6, 1944, nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers assembled in silence. Many carried no rifle, only bayonets, sabers, or grenades. They charged at dawn, screaming, "Tenno Heika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" and crashed into the American lines like a human wave. For a brief moment, the American front wavered under sheer force of numbers. But once again, artillery, tanks, and machine guns turned the tide. When it ended, the beachhead was littered with bodies. Almost every Japanese soldier who had taken part was dead. The final attack had been as tragic as it was futile, a gesture of defiance against a power no human courage could overcome. Saipan was no longer in doubt. The Americans had won, but the true meaning of that victory was only beginning to unfold. By July 9, 1944, the Battle of Saipan was officially declared over. After 25 days of relentless combat, the island lay in ruins. Hills that once bloomed with tropical vegetation were now blackened craters. The smell of smoke, fuel, and decay hung heavy in the humid air. The Japanese garrison, once 32,000 strong, was gone. Fewer than 1,000 prisoners were taken alive. The rest had been killed in action, died by suicide, or vanished into the jungle. The scale of destruction shocked even hardened Marines. Entire valleys were filled with unburied bodies. Caves were packed with the dead, soldiers who had refused surrender even in the final hours. At Marpi Point, hundreds of Japanese civilians, misled by propaganda, leapt from the cliffs into the sea rather than fall into American hands. For the U.S. forces who witnessed it, it was a sight they would never forget. A haunting reminder that the Japanese war machine was not built only on aggression, but on fanatical obedience and fear. Yet beyond the horror, the battle marked a monumental strategic shift. Saipan was now in American hands, and with it came something far greater than territory. From Saipan's newly captured Aslito airfield, engineers began extending runways capable of hosting the B-29 superfortress. Within months, these bombers would bring the war to Tokyo's doorstep. For the first time, Japan's home islands were within direct range of sustained heavy bombing. The fall of Saipan sent shockwaves through the Japanese leadership. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the face of Japan's militarism, was forced to resign. The loss had shattered confidence in the Imperial Army and exposed the fatal weakness of Japan's war strategy. The industrial power of the United States had finally proven unstoppable. On the American side, the victory came at a terrible cost. 3,126 dead, 13,000 wounded, and over 300 missing. The beaches of Saipan were lined with wooden crosses for weeks afterward. But among the exhausted Marines and soldiers, there was a grim pride. They knew they had accomplished something that would change the course of the Pacific War forever. The battle had also revealed a truth that went far beyond tactics. The Japanese had fought with extraordinary bravery, but bravery had met its limit. The Americans had fought with coordination, technology, and supply, and that combination had rewritten the laws of war. In the words of one Japanese officer captured after the battle, they fought like men, but behind them stood a power beyond men. Their ships, their machines, their endless boats. It was as if an entire nation had come to fight us. That was the legacy of Saipan. It was not only a victory of soldiers, but of engineers, laborers, mechanics, and planners, the invisible millions whose work made it possible for America to project power across oceans. Saipan was the turning point, the day when Japan's soldiers saw not just defeat, but the rise of a new kind of warfare, one powered not by heroes, but by industry, systems, and scale. The world would never fight the same way again. When the guns finally fell silent over Saipan, what remained was not just victory, but revelation. The Japanese Marines who had survived understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that they had witnessed the beginning of a new age of warfare. It was not decided by valor, nor by the sword, nor by the courage of men charging into fire. It was decided by machines, logistics, and the will of a nation that could turn its factories into weapons. For generations, the Japanese warrior code, Bushido, had taught that spiritual strength could overcome material weakness. But on the beaches of Saipan, they faced an enemy whose strength was not in spirit alone, but in its capacity to build, move, and sustain. The endless waves of landing craft, the ceaseless hum of ships and engines, the constant arrival of supplies and reinforcements, all of it reflected a kind of warfare they could neither match nor comprehend. To the Japanese, it was horrifying. To the Americans, it was the ultimate proof of what industrial democracy could achieve. Every LCVP, every tank, every rifle had been born in a factory where ordinary citizens worked shifts around the clock, unseen soldiers of a different kind. The invasion of Saipan was not just an assault by 70,000 men, but by a nation of millions, synchronized in purpose. In the aftermath, military historians would call Saipan the graveyard of the Japanese Empire. It was here that the illusion of Japanese invincibility died, and the reality of American dominance in the Pacific became undeniable. The Japanese soldiers' words, "We never saw anything like this," were not just a description of the landing craft. They were an acknowledgement of a deeper truth, that the world had changed forever. After Saipan, the war would continue, to Guam, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa. But the outcome was already written in steel and smoke. The age of the industrial warrior had begun, and from that day forward, every army on Earth would have to answer the same question that echoed across the beaches of Saipan. When courage meets machinery, which truly wins the war?